So, well, I'll start here. It all started in 2019, really in June 5th. I was really living somewhere else, but in June 5th, 2019, the city of Ithaca, mostly because of pressure from the Sunrise Movement, decided to address climate change and codify this into a resolution called the Ithaca Green New Deal. So it was the city's response to the challenge that climate change presents. But it was also a way of putting into a resolution that while we are going to be addressing climate change, we also need to be addressing historical inequity. We need to address economic inequality and racial injustice at the same time. It is a very difficult thing to do, but it is something that we have to do. So we started working on this in 2019. The problem was that COVID hit right after. So there wasn't a lot of work being done. The intention was there, but it really wasn't until 2021 when they hired a director of sustainability, which was the first deliverable of after this resolution. And then I need to be honest with you. When they hired me, they gave me this piece of paper, and I saw that carbon neutrality by 2030. And this is something that I have devoted the last, 15, 20 years of my life. But then looking at this, this is extremely ambitious, and I was like, this is just crazy. Who is able to do something like that? But at the same time, I was like, well, I've never been in this position. I think accepting the challenge is the least I can do when confronted with something like this. So then I took the job. And the first thing that I did was to completely redesign the Green New Deal. Initially, it really was no more than idea, no more than an ambition. But, like all of us working in the climate movement, we know that, you go to Paris, for example, and you have this ambition. But then, from ambition to pledge, you actually lose a lot. And then once you have a pledge, you have a negotiation, and then you bring it back to your country, negotiate with the president, with Congress, and what we see is something that is not what we really need. So then, if you think about it, if the whole country cannot go in one direction, if the whole state cannot agree on how to do this, it is for municipal government. That is where the rubber hits the road, and therefore it becomes even more of a responsibility to do something. So my job was to make that happen. So the way I translated this into something actionable was, okay, we need to do three things. And I'm going to oversimplify things, but it's the best way I can explain this. So yeah, we need to reduce carbon emissions. That's what the whole thing is about. But to do that, we need to reduce energy intensity. We really need to use less energy per GDP unit. And we also need to make sure that for every unit of energy, we can reduce its carbon intensity. So this was it. This resolution, what it means is two things. One, we need to have social justice, environmental justice in mind, and we're going to call it climate justice together. And that's going to be the lens through which we're going to see three things: how we reduce carbon intensity, energy intensity, and overall carbon emissions. So we are fortunate because, as you know, we live in the state of New York with very, very ambitious targets. Right now, the governor is looking into doing all of these things. In the latest State of the State address, I mean, it was incredible that she alluded to the idea of removing 185 trillion BDUs of used energy. If you haven't done the math, that means removing 430 billion light bulbs. That is the equivalent of what the ambition for the state of New York is. So it is something very difficult to achieve, but if we don't try, we'll never know. In the city of Ithaca, it's different. We have a very different economy. So the first thing that I did once I translated this into something that we could understand better was to do an analysis in terms of carbon emissions. We didn't do a greenhouse gas inventory because we just don't have the time. We're going to do that in parallel, but we did mathematical modeling. And based on this modeling, we determined that we had 400,000 metric tons of CO2, which for some of you, it means something. And for those who still the math may be complicated, it really means like 100,000 vehicles going at it at the same time outside your house. That is more or less the emissions that we have in the city of Ithaca. 40% of the emissions really come from buildings, and inside buildings, it really comes from energy use for heat. Either space, water, cooking, drying clothes. But that's how we use most of the energy in a building. And then 40% comes from transportation. That includes passenger vehicles, obviously, but also heavy-duty vehicles, off-road vehicles in general. 50% comes from the grid. And, it is a tricky thing, right? But the way the grid is structured, I come from the energy world. So looking at the grid and looking at transmission lines and looking at how we are connected, there is a very high likelihood that the city of Ithaca has about 85% of its electricity carbon-free because it's highly dependent on nuclear and hydro. So in this case, when we did the analysis of the emissions, we determined that only 15% really come from the grid. And there is 5% that comes from waste. But then we needed to simplify this even further. We need to think about a strategy to do this. And I figure, okay, we need to do three things, and if we are lucky, a fourth one. We need to do energy efficiency across all aspects of the economy. And with this, I mean energy efficiency, think about how we use energy and think about really hard how we can, for example, use energy. If we open the tap, for example, to get some water, there is a pump that is bringing water to our house. And then if you think about it, every time you flush, then, something is taking the water out. So we need to think about it in those terms. Energy efficiency needs to be in everything that we do. The carbonization of the electric grid, we need to start thinking about it given what we can do. The city of Ithaca has very little control. We have some influence, but we don't have that much control in terms of electricity generation. But what we can do is deploy more solar. And then electrification. In the entire planet, you can electrify 65% of the energy stock. The rest require low carbon fuels. But in the city of Ithaca, it's about 85%. So what that means is that we can electrify pretty much everything that we have. And then if we're lucky, we can do carbon capture. But what this means is, out of the 400,000 metric tons of CO2, if we were to do energy efficiency across all aspects, we would reduce 30% of the emissions, which if we were to do electrification of buildings, of vehicles, of everything that we can, we will also reduce 30% of the emissions. And then 20% would come if we were to remove emissions from electricity. And then we're left with 20%, which is really, the remaining part of what we need to do. So then it became really interesting because, once I was confronted with all this, I was like, okay, we need to do something fast, and we need to do something that has not been attempted, because what we have seen is that everything seems to be not necessarily failing, but not having the speed and the urgency that we need. So the idea was to create something big. And then I saw that if I were to do numbers about everything that needed to be done, we needed about $2 billion to make this happen just in the city of Ithaca. I mean, it's incredible when you think about the cost of this transition, and then you think about how much money should go to a Buffalo Bills stadium versus, moving away from fossil fuels. It drives you crazy. But if you think about it, just for the city of Ithaca, $2 billion, for the entire country, it's $3.4 trillion if you believe Princeton University, or it's about $5 trillion if you believe Stanford. At the end of the day, we all agree it's a huge number, and we need to be efficient in the way we use our resources. Then the interesting thing is, how do you sell these to legislators? How do you sell these to people in the city council, people who do this part-time, people who do something else completely unrelated to what we do and care about, but still they need to agree with it because they are the ones that can make it happen. So then we figure, okay, let's look at it very differently. Let's look at it from energy efficiency point of view. 30% of the emissions will go if we do energy efficiency. What is it what it means? It means, well, for our buildings, they have to be thermally efficient as possible. We need to look at our buildings in a very different way, and we need to start thinking about what would make better use of energy in a building. For example, if we were to have better insulation or air sealing, what if we were to have better windows, high-performance windows? What if we were to have, everything that would make the building more thermally comfortable? But then we also need to look at, what circular economy could mean for the city. For example, we need to stop talking about waste, and we need to talk about, materials reuse and resource recovery, for example. We also need to think about people driving single passenger vehicles. I mean, we need to get people to use transit and to use bikes. So we need to convince people to move to a different mindset. So that's what energy efficiency means. If we were to do this, we would reduce 30% of the emissions. But if we were to electrify all the thermal loads, that is, if we were to electrify everything that uses energy, either for heat in the case of a building or for movement in the case of a car, if we were to electrify that, then we'll be able to reduce 30% of the emissions. That is space heating. We can replace space heating, water heating, even clothes dryers with heat pumps. But if we were to replace, natural gas cooking stoves, if we were to replace that with induction range, for example, and then it was very interesting because when we were defining these, we started looking at, okay, what does it actually mean? Because, if we were to include all of these new elements, that require more electricity, there is a chance that we would need to change the electrical panel in a building. We will need to change the way electricity is distributed inside a building. And then we saw that the type of installation that you need for an electric clothes dryer, a heat pump, it is exactly the same one that you need for an EV charging station. So what that means is we could take advantage of doing this, and we can create economies of scale inside a building to make this happen. And then we can actually look at beyond that and look at the economic benefits of co-deploying heat pumps and solar panels or energy storage. And then we could look at, okay, we're electrifying passenger vehicles. Perhaps we could start electrifying transport or refuse trucks. Like, for example, right now in the city of Ithaca, we have 7 electric buses from TCAT. We're in the process of acquiring the next 10. And then my hope is that in the next 3 years, we're going to be able to have at least 70% of the fleet fully electrified. And the same thing goes for the police fleet, for the fire fleet, and refuse trucks. We're in the process of negotiating the first fully electric refuse garbage truck for the city. All of this is really hard because it messes with the way the city operates. And if you know anything about how to manage a city, you would know that budget is something that, we don't have a luxury to alter it every 5 minutes whenever we get a good idea. And this is very difficult. So we need to figure out how to pay for all of these. Because at the end, we're going to have to go even beyond what I'm talking about. We're going to have to include new technologies to do carbon capture. For example, right now, the city of Ithaca has one of the most advanced wastewater treatment plants in the country. And we're not taking full advantage of it, but we want to change that. Because right now, what we're doing is after a biodigester that helps us to capture biogas and then produce electricity with it, we take the organic waste still to the landfill. What if we were to take that into a gasification chamber, a pyrolysis system? What if we were to take that? We would actually sequester the carbon that wouldn't have to go to the landfill. We would have biochar, and this biochar can be used for composting. Hell, even has hydrogen and carbon neutral hydrogen as a byproduct. There are so many things that we can do with what we have today, because at the end of the day, this needs to happen. It needs to happen soon. But we need to be mindful that whatever we do, we need to take climate justice into account. There is no way we can do this and not think about all the people that historically have not been part of the decision. The city of Ithaca, I honestly love it. It's a wonderful place. But I cannot help but noticing that a lot of the time I am the only one who's not white in a room. I am the only one who is of brown skin negotiating with somebody else how to pay for this, how to electrify something. We need diversity. And what happened was a lot of people have been gentrified out of the city. There is this neighborhood called Southside. And Southside used to have 70% black population. Today it has 3%. People have been gentrified out of the city, and we need to change that. So our lens of climate justice need to help us really make sure that we are doing this right by people and correcting historical inequities, but also looking at who, because of COVID, because of the economic downturn, is more likely to be affected by climate change. And if we identify those groups, then we'll be able to do something about it. But we need a plan. We need a climate action plan. And we're working on that right now. The one thing that is wonderful about everything that we're doing in the city is that by putting it in a climate action plan, it actually counts as a climate risk disclosure. And what that means is that the city, by addressing climate risk, can actually can issue debt in a way that it couldn't before, with better provisions and better rates. It's a funny thing. By addressing climate change, we can actually issue debt so we can finance more of infrastructure that we have. But we need to do it differently. We need to engage the community beyond consultation. This is not about asking people what they need. It's about engaging people through a democratic process in the identifying the problem, figuring out the solution, financing the solution, making it work. And we're doing that. There is a program that we call 1,000 Conversations with the Community, through which we are engaging people in developing solutions with us to make it work. And then there is a component of workforce development. Think about, all buildings in the city of Ithaca, which is what we're doing right now, doing energy assessments so we can retrofit. And in retrofitting, we need to do a number of things that involves different trades, and then electrifying. And then by electrifying, we are installing, but at the same time, we're taking new materials. And these materials need to be recycled, need to be, think about all of these that you have on the screen on the second line. Imagine that we're going to be doing that for 6,000 buildings in the city. We're going to produce a lot of trash if we don't take care of these. So workforce development goes beyond beyond just retrofitting and electrification. It has to do with everything. But this means we're altering the way we look at workforce development. We are developing new ways of doing this. And we're also looking at the effect it will have on our infrastructure because, trust me, if we want to move away from natural gas and we want to electrify everything, our cities are not built for that. And this is where my background actually became useful because I know for a fact that the city of Ithaca can only electrify at about 15 to 20%. Beyond that, literally the city will catch fire. So what we need to do is to get investment in the distribution grid, in transmission. And who we need to talk to? Well, the Public Service Commission, the utility company, but also the federal government through the infrastructure law. I mean, right now is where everything comes together because without that part, we cannot do anything really. Because at the end of the day, the future looks very different. It looks efficient. It looks interconnected. It looks like energy assets are everywhere and they are not dependent on fossil fuels. So there are many ways of doing this. And of course, we can just not do anything, but we can do part of it. And I told that to the city council. Okay, if you want me to remove just 25% of the emissions, well, at least for that, I need $400 million. It's not cheap, it's not easy, and we can do this. But then if you want me to take on 75% of the buildings and lead to 50% reduction in emissions, I'm going to need like $700 million. And if you want me to do this, and take on everything that we have in the city, except perhaps sequestering carbon or what is very difficult to electrify, then that we're talking about $1.5 billion. $2 billion is what it takes to do everything that we want to do. I'm talking about leaf blowers, lawnmowers, refuse trucks. I'm talking about flowers. I'm talking about everything that uses natural gas, that uses gasoline, that uses diesel, any form of fossil fuels, and replace it with something that doesn't in the next 8 years. It is a nightmare. It is a wonderful one. And I love being engaged with this process. But the reality is that this is expensive and this is hard, so we need to be creative. And we need to do this in coordination with so many things. So right now, the city of Ithaca started working on sustainability 12 months ago. Today, we have 12 programs ongoing in parallel. Four of them really focusing on infrastructure that has to do with buildings, has to do with transportation, but also looking at the foundational elements that are needed, such as climate justice, workforce development, and democratic engagement. Just very quickly, I want to share with you what we think of in terms of Justice 50, in terms of climate justice. Because as you know, the state government, the CLCPA, the Just Transition Working Group, they've been working on identifying how we can first identify climate justice communities and then how we can operationalize that. Because once you identify the people that need most help, how do you actually get the help to them in the most efficient possible way? Well, the city of Ithaca is looking at that, and we came up with a program that we call Justice 50, which if you're familiar with the federal government's program, Justice 40, then you will understand that what we're trying to do is to redirect 50% of the benefits of what we are doing to disadvantaged communities. And here's where it gets really interesting. We have 23.4% of the population that could qualify as a disadvantaged community. And we want to redirect 50% of the benefits. What that means is, think about it in practical terms. For 1/4 of the population, we're going to devote half of the resources that we have. And what that means is for every person that is part of the disadvantaged community, we're dedicating twice as much money as we are to other members of the community. And it seems unfair for so many people. It seems like, why would we do that? I pay more taxes. That's the answer that we get all the time. But the reality is that we live in a world where climate justice, social justice, environmental justice now are at the very center of everything that we have to do to make this right. So the city of Ithaca is working really hard at this, and we're hopeful that we are going to have a program that will be a landmark for the entire country. Right now, we have also a program that is the Green Jobs Corridor, and I am very happy to say that we have successfully created something we call the Green Jobs Corridor. The city of Ithaca has this market. It decided to go after it and electrify every single building in the city. But we just don't have the workforce. We're 30,000 people in the city, and we estimate we need actually the numbers for the entire Green New Deal is about 3,500 people that we need to take on these jobs. So it's not that we are going to get 10% of the population of the city of Ithaca to take on all of these new jobs. We need to look at other places. This is a problem that we all have in New York, not only the city of Ithaca. So what is it that we did? Well, I got into my car and I drove to Elmira and I talked to the mayor and then to Binghamton, then to Syracuse, then to Rochester. And we all agree that probably right now the city of Ithaca has a market and has opportunity. and local companies need local workers. But what if we were to share the cost of transportation, of childcare, of language support, and then have people move from these cities to Ithaca, participate on learning on the job or apprenticeship program, getting paid to learn while we do this in Ithaca, and then probably in a year or in 2 years, when these programs are already being implemented in these cities, these people can come back and become the foundational element for local workforce development program. So we figure that we can do this because what we need to do is to get our buildings, for example, to be carbon neutral. And we can address this through policy, legislation. We can have energy codes, the construction ordinance. We can have an energy performance standard. But what we need to do is to change people's mindset. We need to do things different. And this is funny because when I say we need to change people's minds, God, it is so difficult. It is so hard. You have no idea like how much time. I mean, putting together the financial elements, the technological elements hasn't been as hard as identifying people that can contribute to this process. So we decided to do something that we believe is very efficient. We decided, okay, if we were to think about electrification in the same way we think about the way technology spreads, we could actually have, similar way of looking at the population. And what we came up with is, it is about 35% of the population in Ithaca that actually fall on the other side of the political spectrum. They don't believe in climate change. So we're not going to bother. But we're literally not going to bother. We're not going to go after them. We have also about 15% that already have Teslas, people that are already working on a number of things, and they're going to do it. This is the field of dreams approach. They just need us to stimulate them. What really matters is what we have in the middle. It's 50% of the population. But out of those, half of them are already receiving incentives because they are low income. So for us, it's just about creating the right incentives to bring them along. So we believe, and this is what we uncovered recently, that 30% of the population of the city of Ithaca need to come on board. That's all we need because that 30% is the nudge that we need, and this is behavioral economics. That is the nudge that we need to bring everybody else on board. But then, once we have that 30%, I can also claim, and this is policy and legislation, I can also claim that 34% of the population, the laggards, those that don't believe in this, are disproportionately harming others by not reducing emissions. And that's when we can legislate, and we can get people to actually do something. So that is the strategy that we have. First, create a market incentive, creating economic incentives for low income, have the early adopters come on board quicker than what they're doing right now, and then eventually go for everybody else. I won't take much longer. I just want to share a couple of things more with you. One is, we're conscious that there are so many challenges. Financial challenges, for example, every building. When we combine single family and multifamily, in average, every building is going to cost about $50,000. This is hard because, just thinking about residential, we need a ton of money. So right now, the city has commitments that exceed $400 million finally. So we managed to bring that money from the private sector. And we managed to repurpose federal dollars and state dollars to reduce the cost of capital and help private investors make the numbers work so we can have this in the city without having the community paying for it. There are economic challenges because when you're trying to replace gas, especially with electricity prices today, it's really, really hard. There's no way of making the business case. But what if we were to change rates? What if we were to talk to the Public Service Commission and we change the electricity rates or the way they're formulated, and we were to have a rate that is based on demand, demand-based rate? This is something that already exists, but we don't have it available in New York. But if we were to have that, the numbers may actually work. Now, obviously, we need to work with the utility company to change the infrastructure, and we need to develop workforce. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult to take on a whole city like you see. Right now, this slide is just to show you we develop a tool that allows us right now, if you give me an address in the city of Ithaca, I can identify the energy profile of that building. What that means is based on the age of the building, the materials, the orientation, if it is residential or commercial, I can tell you what is the energy profile. Therefore, I can tell you that if we were to do electrification, there's going to be savings or not. And that's the way we can actually bring people along and tell them, I believe there's a high likelihood that we're going to have energy savings if you were to move in this direction. Finally, this is the last one. What we did was raise capital. because we figure there's not enough money in government. We need more than $100 million to do this. So we set out to raise 100. We ended up raising more than 400. At this point, and what we did was think about it in terms of mortgages. If we were to think about this in the same way, like interest rates, they tend to be higher for people with higher risk, that is low income. But what if we were to address risk in this case? Because I don't know if you think about it that way, but the way I think about climate change and what we do is risk mitigation. We're mitigating the risk of extinction. And so when I try to do this, implement a program in the city of Ithaca, I'm thinking about risk mitigation. But I'm thinking about it in financial terms. I'm thinking about, okay, if I were to do every building, I have a portfolio of buildings. Every building is so different. The owners are so different. That gives me enough diversity in that portfolio of buildings that basically the probability of default, if we were to use private money, is practically zero. But if we were to have a long-term program backed by the government, that gives certainty. And if I created programs, financial programs that are long-term lending and leasing, then suddenly there is no risk really associated with this program. Then I can rely on state incentives and federal incentives and rebates from the utility company, which when combined with all of these risk mitigating measures, suddenly, imagine this, I have $100 million from a private investor, and they are expecting 7% in return. But then I talk to the state government and the federal government and tell them, instead of giving money to each home individually, put it towards this program, and that money could actually cover the return that investors are expecting. So that money can actually flow to the community free of interest. And that is probably the way we can do this, because if we manage to have energy savings, people only need to pay based on savings. So at the end of the day, nobody's paying for anything else, and we are reducing emissions. But then in the city, we decided to create also the Ithaca Electrification Fund, because yes, one concern is the electricity will go up and people will have higher energy burdens. But we want to reduce that. What if we were to create a fund to reduce energy burden? Anything that goes above what you were paying or what you should be paying, perhaps we can cover it. So we are talking to philanthropic organizations and government entities so we can actually do that. So that is what we did in the city of Ithaca. We have an RFP. We had an RFP in August last year to see if somebody could guide the city in this process. We believe we cover all angles, but we needed somebody that does this for a living. A consortium responded. So right now, the city of Ithaca is working with 57 organizations to make this happen, led by Block Power. But at the end of the day, there are so many moving parts because what we're doing is very, very difficult. But, it's part of what we have to do. And I love saying this to my team and everybody else, which is, if we don't shoot for the stars, we're not even starting. We need to try something huge. Let's think about 1,000 buildings, 1,000 new jobs, 1,000 electric vehicles, 1,000 conversations with the community in the first 3 years. So that's our goal. That's what we're going after. It's hard. It's a lot of fun. And I'm very happy to be able to share this with you. So